Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I was commissioned to write a dictionary of contemporary design, which was going to be 200,000 words long, have 1,000 pages, and be extraordinarily comprehensive. But about a year into the contract, I had a phone call from Stephen McGrath, the editor at Penguin, who said, "Deyan, people don't buy dictionaries anymore. They've been exploded by the digital revolution. What are we going to do?" So we thought about it. And in the end, what we've come up with is B's for Bauhaus, a title which is slightly misleading in that it's not actually that much about the Bauhaus. The first item is A is for authentic. Exhibit A is a possibly Korean-era American Army parka. Now, I wear this to really embarrass my family. They back away and say, "What are you doing? You're trying to pretend that back in West London where you grew up, you were once a mod with a scooter." In fact, I wasn't. It's not nostalgia. But what actually attracted me is the idea of authenticity. Somehow this gives the impression of being a garment which was designed without being designed. So it's about function. It's got this fantastic tassel on the zip, which itself is a wonder of brass construction, designed so that you could actually open and close it in sub-zero conditions. The sleeves are held in place by webbing and buttons. It is apparently authentic. And yet, of course, it's the kind of thing which designers love because they love to fake authenticity with extraordinary attention to detail. The chapter also looks at how typography addresses the same issue. And those of you who are graphic design in the audience will immediately recognize the font here as Gotham, a font which was designed in the 1980s as a font by Frere Jones for an American magazine called Esquire, which, as he puts it, is trying to evoke the great period of anonymous design in America, the period of the Hoover Dam, the period of FDR, the time when a font could reflect sober honesty and straightforwardness. Of course, now it's carefully contrived by graphic designers, and it was used by Obama in his first election campaign, because though he wanted to kind of present the aura of the New Deal, he couldn't actually afford it, except in his posters. So B is for Bauhaus, of course. For me, a fascinating exploration of the myth of a city, which when the Bauhaus moved to Dessau, it was a city of 80,000 people, and yet for 5 years it could be seen as the world's capital of design. To run such an ambitious educational program in a city of 80,000 people would now seem impossible. What is it that's become so different about the world in which more and more ideas concentrate in fewer and fewer places? It's also a fascinating moment in that one reflects also, typographically speaking, that in the days when the Bauhaus was flourishing, its typographers went out of their way to insist on using a lowercase b for Bauhaus. Otto Leiker, who went on to found the Ulm Hochschule, once memorably suggested that if only the Germans had been more resistant to capital letters, they might also resist fascism slightly more effectively. Maybe a view of how design, from some points of view, especially from graphic design, can be said to be looking at the world through a letterbox. B is for blueprint. A reflection, I suppose, on how magazines can impact on the way that design is discussed. Blueprint was started in 1983 by a collective, cooperative of designers, architects, critics, photographers. And as is often the way, iconoclasm in critical moments comes when one generation tries to supplant their predecessors. So in our day, in the 1980s, we were trying to kill off the sacred cows in those days, the Hugh Cassins of this world, by championing another generation who are somehow going to change the way that the world saw design. And of course, the subtext is that as we champion a new generation, so we critics rise with our creations. And of course, now the survivors of that generation wait pitifully to be dispatched by our successors in electronic haikus, 140 characters at a time. Or of course, if we're sharp enough, we try and dispatch our discoveries as well and find a new lot to champion. Critical design, in many ways, I think is the most fascinating. This chapter was triggered by my coming across the work of Dunn and Raby, a pair of very interesting professors at the Royal College of Art who run the Interaction studio. And the thinking here was triggered around the idea of an object they'd made, which they call the Huggable atomic mushroom, which at first sight is a very soft woolen Ottoman stool, which, when you look at it very closely, takes the form of a mushroom cloud with a stalk and a toadstool. It's the sort of thing that W.B. Yeats had a better name for, A Terrible Beauty is Born. On the one hand, it's actually an object which asks to be taken as a piece of furniture, but actually, in the hands of Dunn and Raby, it's an example of critical design, an object which is asking us to understand design from a very different point of view. Is design about asking questions, or is it about offering solutions? For Dunn and Raby, it is certainly that sense of asking us to consider technology, understanding that design is not only that naivety of trying to manipulate us into buying things, stimulating our want glands, it's also trying to look at the questions of what design might be about. Now, it is actually a long-term tradition in British design. In my days as a journalist, one of the most hostile postbags that I ever had was when I reviewed Fiona McCarthy's excellent biography of William Morris, who, among other things, refused to set foot inside the Great Exhibition in 1851 when he was taken there by his mother as a birthday treat, on the basis that he knew that everything inside it would be meretricious, machine-made junk. And yet, somehow, he's also seen as being the father of modern design. And for a long time, I really found it quite hard to really get a handle on Morris. On the one hand, he was a revolutionary socialist. On the other hand, he was also a man who longed to design beautiful wallpaper, a combination that's beyond parody, one might say. He was a man who made his living by, as he put it, pandering to the swinish luxury of the rich, words he actually used in the presence of one of his clients. And yet he was also a dedicated anti-colonialist and a believer in the rights of women. He was someone who wanted to give working people honestly made products, and yet by his rejection of machinery, he made it impossible for those people to afford them. So on the one hand, is he a failure as a designer? On the other hand, is he actually offering something more, looking beyond the surface of what design might be? What really got Morris's enthusiast upset was in my review in the Sunday Times, when I couldn't help myself but point out there was a certain synchronicity, congruity between Morris's famous science fiction novel, News from Nowhere, in which he envisaged a London post the death of industrialization, in which London had been abandoned, Parliament Square was a dung heap in which worthless banknotes were fluttering, a vision of his view of an agrarian anarchist system. I couldn't help myself, but somehow thought, isn't this a bit like Year Zero in Pol Pot's Cambodia? And foolishly I put it into print. And of course I wasn't suggesting that Morris was some kind of psychopathic authoritarian monster, but it was too late, the damage was done. In recent years, I suppose I've got to be much more warm about how I see Morris. Early on in my career, I used to look at almost the simultaneous invention of Tonnet, the furniture company that was originally established in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which for the first time brought mechanical production to furniture, which with its Brentwood cafe chair was able to produce objects in their millions at affordable prices with some beauty, and Morris, who with Morris & Co. could make furniture that very few people could afford. You could say that Tonnet was doing to furniture production what McDonald's have done to catering, in that they actually de-skilled it, made it cheap and palatable, but not necessarily very nutritious. Probably Tonnet have done better than that. If you actually understand Morris's view of design as being critical design, of saying what are the alternatives to this idea that design is about cynical manipulation, about persuading us to buy things that we don't need, if it's about the idea of what design could be, the idea that design might have more to offer than that simple commercial understanding, perhaps we can actually achieve something. For the first time I went to see the Red House, Morris's remarkable first home in Bexley Heath, designed for him by the architect Philip Webb, who memorably went on to say that no architect should be allowed to design a house till they're past 40. He was 28 and confessed to getting the house the wrong way around. But when you actually see the Red House now, Bexley Heath is not perhaps the most inspiring of London suburbs, and you tramp your way from the station through pebble-dashed streets, and then suddenly you find this other world of Morrisness, this world of mellow red brick, this idea that life could be transformed by a view of the world. Then suddenly you see what level of achievement he had, and maybe one can start to deal with some of those thoughts that he had about the evils of industrialization in a different way. Perhaps he was a forerunner of the critical design that Dunn and Raby are trying to teach their students at the Royal College of Art now. Critical design, on the one hand, seems like biting the hand that feeds it. Design, in the view of those of us who see it as a reflection of mass production, probably began sometime in the early 19th, late 18th century, when the connection between the designer and the maker was cut by mass production. A previous model was to say that there was a direct relationship between the maker and the user, that you would actually make things to order, tailor-making them. Mass production, of course, reduces the costs hugely by increasing the cost of the production process and requires the intervention of a designer to shape things for that mass audience. Given that, one could say that the very idea of critical design is like biting the hand that feeds the designer. Imagine the idea of critical dentistry or critical civil engineering. You don't want people to ask questions when there's things at stake in your root canals. And yet design has always had this perhaps schizophrenic cut between those who are there to manipulate, those who invent those wonderful typefaces, those people who use the vocabulary of the Parker to produce things which maybe are not authentic but have been lovingly faked, on the one side, to those who see design as being some kind of moral crusade, some sense of what life could be like rather than what it is. It's there in the writings of Victor Papanek, whose approach was perhaps even more hostile than Morris's, who simply refused to go inside the Great Exhibition. Papanek once memorably suggested that there are some professions that are more destructive and dangerous than industrial design, but only a few. And in his idea, design should only be about socially worthwhile projects, water purification schemes, wirelesses that can operate without mains electricity. And yet there was something about his approach to it that seemed too much of a kind of moral crusade, refusing to use those aspects of the design dialogue and debate which Dunn and Raby do engage with, who actually have the sophistication to use the techniques of design, that sense of actually communicating on multiple levels. Design does have that ability to make suggestions without necessarily putting things into words, which I find fascinating and endlessly interesting. It's a tradition which was healthy in Italy during the 1970s and 1980s, when Italy had that extraordinary generation of designers led by Ettore Sottsass and Andrea Mendini, who were able to pursue parallel careers. So Sottsass was both a poet, a painter, a photographer, a man who began his career by making silver baskets in the 1950s, who was suddenly called up by the Olivetti family to say, would you like to get involved with designing the world's first mainframe Italian-made computer? He said yes, which I think reflects something both on the nature of Sottsass and that openness of a generation of industrialists that Italy once had. When I was researching into a project I've been doing on Sottsass, I went to his archive and discovered the first piece of paper in which he began that project of the mainframe computer, which in those days, of course, was the size of a house and had the capacity of perhaps complete works of Tolstoy. And Sottsass wrote himself this note in 1959, asking himself the question, what should a computer look like? Not like a washing machine, which I think is a fascinating insight into how the designer's imagination quite works. But of course, we are now in this period when design has separated out. It is the commercial and the questioning. It's also the star and the team. We do have this burden of the idea of the designer as superstar, in which the designer themselves is their own greatest creation. It's something that goes back to Raymond Loewy, a designer who memorably suggested that he was in business to streamline the sales curve, who proudly boasted that by working for Lucky Strike and changing the color of the cigarette pack from green to white, he doubled sales. Not the kind of boast you make these days. To, on the other side of the picture, a William Morris or a Dieter Rams, for whom the idea about design is to find something utterly timeless. We are, though, in a world which is speeding up faster and faster. There was a generation which is personified by Jonathan Ive, the British trained designer who now sits in Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, in which he actually is the last of the generation which saw design as being something which came from physical making, of touch, of tactile values, of investing endless time and energy into making the perfectly radiused corner, using an aluminium finish for a laptop computer because it had that sense of growing old gracefully rather than polycarbonate, which actually tends to show the marks of the skin rather badly. Ive perhaps represents the last of the generation of designers who were able to operate in that sense. And I saw him last summer, and he was talking about the difficulties of operating in a climate in which, as he puts it, it took 50 years for the telephone with copper wires to go from being a working prototype to mass market acceptance. It took 15 years for the fax machine to do the same thing. And as he put it, it took 6 weeks for the tablet computer to go from being that to a mass market product. And where does that leave the designer? What has design become in that sense? And another kind of generation of designer, who perhaps aren't even called designers, but Chad Hurley, after he graduated from design school, his first job he got by seeing an article in Wired magazine about a new finance-orientated startup in California, and he wrote to them offering to design their logo free of charge, which they accepted. It wasn't actually that beautiful a logo, but he'd learned some coding skills while he was a student, and he went on to do a few other projects for them. That company actually was PayPal, and he designed for them a button, not a physical, tangible button, but a button which was so useful in financial transactions that PayPal was bought by eBay, because it was actually the most efficient way of conducting their transactions, 3 years after the startup. And they paid $1.2 billion for that startup. From his share of the proceeds, Hurley went on to do something else before he was 40, which was start another startup, which was called YouTube. So there we go, from a designer from school to being a billionaire in 6 years. We are now in a moment where the world is accelerating faster and faster, and design is really an essential part of that. To me, the really fascinating thing about design is that it never stays the same. Its shape keeps moving on. It becomes about different things. To me, it's a way for understanding the world around us, for decoding its symbols and signals. 25 years ago, when the Design Museum started, one of the most popular things that the museum had was a selection of carefully made, carefully selected chairs could in some senses be used to show the history of design up to the present day. Some of these chairs do actually exercise a remarkable hold on the imagination of designers. You can see why. In that climate of things speeding up faster and faster, in which a mobile phone is replaced every 9 months, there's not a great deal of satisfaction in being the person to actually restyled an object which disappears in that period of time. But if you are a designer of a successful chair, like Charles and Ray Eames, your work can still seem relevant and powerful 60 years later. Nevertheless, there is an awful amount of energy poured into continually refining what we'd have thought was a problem that had been sorted out long ago, the chair. And there's a few other categories of product which have the same thing. Bicycles are always being tinkered with, or bottle openers for some reason. People are always trying to find new ways to design a bottle opener. That sense of design being about a few things was once the limits of the perspectives of design. You could actually analyze a chair from the social point of view, what it said about function, what do we mean by function. I mean, function is this word which we think of as being technical, and yet also has, I think, a poetic sense. When Shelley suggested that truth is beauty and beauty truth, that is all you need to know, you could actually see he was actually setting the agenda for functionalism. But functionalism, of course, in the sense of that it's an idea rather than a formula for making something fulfill a purpose. Purpose has got so many broader definitions than the ostensible function. Function is a kind of alibi in the same sense that the Parker is about cold weather, keeping the rain off, keeping the snow off, but that's really an alibi. It's also for the pleasures of something that's well made, the sense of that heavy brass zip. Function has so many different meanings. So as I try to kind of convey, once design could be seen as the physical form of a chair, its technology, its sculptural qualities, its sense of purpose, but now that definition of what design is keeps changing, keeps shape-shifting. Yes, it's about non-tangible things. Last year, the Designs of the Year Prize at the Design Museum went to gov.uk, the government website, which got the Daily Mail somewhat upset, but it's also a reflection of how important the digital world has become. It's not just a website which is easy to use, it's the way that people communicate with the government at every level. It's a reflection of the country's national identity. So design has that ability to go on being about the things that matter. Design is a kind of early warning system to the things that are going to be shaping our lives.
I'm pleased that you mentioned the Designs of the Year and the award to gov.uk. It's something that we talk a lot about here. in our work on design, and design as a process of inquiry and the ability of design to ask questions and hopefully provide solutions as well. And I wonder if we could get your take on whether or not you do think we're entering a new discipline of design with critical design.
Well, I think, as I tried to say, that there's always been a strand to what design can be, the sense that Morris was actually saying, is the designer a willing participant in this commercial trick of persuading people to buy stuff, of adding value, of branding, and yet it's also about those who try and see what might make the world a better place to be. I suppose the problem is when design only becomes about asking questions, maybe it's the same question too often, and maybe there are times when you think, yes, yes, but what is the answer? It is the essence of design, I think. It is what makes design such a powerful and important discipline. It's the ability to try and understand a wider take on complicated systems. It's trying to actually make things work as a pattern, rather than to accept what's there as things stand. It's trying to get the most out of things. It's a fashion designer who's ready to look at what the positive aspects of imperfection might be as opposed to the perfect. It might be difficult to make something perfect, but you know what it is. But trying to understand the qualities of imperfection is much more potentially rewarding and much more difficult. It's asking the designer to really justify every decision, to explore at every stage of the process.